I'm Esther, and this is my husband Frank. Welcome to Bible Now. This is Talk 14, which is readings 76 through 81. If you have your reading layout, you can see we're finishing Numbers and covering all of 1st and 2nd Peter. If you have your Bible, you can follow along with us.
Okay, a couple of weeks ago, we were in Hebrews, and we talked about Hebrews 11:6, how it says, without faith it's impossible to please God. It gave us the hall of fame of the people of faith and had a whole list of Old Testament saints that God was really pleased with because of their faith. Then last week we finished up the book of Numbers, and we found out that there was a whole generation of people whose heart was hard, lacked faith, and because of those, they missed God's best. They missed the promised land, and God was not pleased with them. Today, we're going to look at Israel's enemies plotting behind the scenes to make the people of God stumble in their faith. And we'll see that through the chapters we go through. Then in 1 Peter, we're going to talk about faith and how God says your faith is more precious than gold. And in 2 Peter, he's going to teach us how to never stumble in our faith. Okay, so let's start in Numbers 22. This is towards the end of the 40 years of them being in the wilderness. Right now, they're camping at the plains of Moab with 2 to 3 million people among them along the east side of the Jordan River. The land that God promised Abraham was on the west side of the Jordan River, so they're close. Okay, the king of Moab, he is terrified because he knows that these people just destroyed 2 other kingdoms, and here they're on his land. So he teams up with this other king, the king of Midian, and they pay Balaam to have him come and put a curse over the Israelites. Okay? Balaam is a false prophet. We'll talk more about him. But there was a common belief in the ancient times that the outcome of war was determined by the gods. So they would hire a diviner like Balaam to manipulate a god like Jehovah to turn against his own people. So the story of Balaam is one of the craziest stories in the Bible, from talking animals to a false pagan prophet who, when God's Spirit comes upon him, he prophesies some of the greatest messianic prophecies that we have in the Old Testament. It's really wild. We meet Balaam when the first delegation of people from the king of Moab arrive at his home in Pethor in Mesopotamia. It's about 400 miles away from where he was. So he had a great reputation. Now, chapter 22, look at verse 8. If you look at it, at first it looks like Balaam is a Yahweh worshiper because he tells the delegation, I will report back to you. They were going to spend the night. I'll report back to you what Yahweh says. All right? And don't forget that it was his job to know all the gods and their stories and their rituals. He had to know about the history of the Israelites when they came out of Egypt 40 years previous, because even like the prostitute Rahab and the whole city of Jericho that were just on the other side of the Jordan River, they knew the stories. So Balaam had to know the stories. And we're going to read about Rahab and Jericho in the book of Joshua. Okay, but then Yahweh answers Balaam, and this is not strange, as the Lord does speak to heathen kings in the Old Testament. Okay, now Yahweh is very clear with his answer to Balaam. He says, do not go and do not curse these people. Yes, this is Yahweh, okay, but the Hebrew uses a different word here, and Esther's going to tell us about that.
Yeah, this story keeps switching back and forth with the word God and the word Lord. Like in the slide, God will, of course, start with a capital G. Lord is in all capitals, though, and I'm going to try to explain that. So when you see the word God, the Hebrew looks like this. It's pronounced Elohim. This sometimes refers specifically to the God of the Bible, the God of Israel, and it's capitalized so it looks to us like a name. But this is actually a generic term that can refer to some other spiritual being. When that's happening, our Bibles will say little g, God. But sometimes, like here, it's not totally clear which is meant. So we've got to take clues from the rest of the passage. When you see Lord in all uppercase letters, the Hebrew looks like this. This is Yahweh. So Israel has a God, has an Elohim, but his name is not God. His name is Yahweh. By the way, this is sometimes transliterated as Jehovah. Frank used that term a minute ago. It's highly likely that it was originally pronounced Yahweh. There's a little more detail on that in a separate video that I'm going to link below. Now, other nations had other Elohim, other little g gods, other spiritual beings that they worshipped. So there were little g gods in Egypt. There were little g gods in Canaan. And Balaam knew all of them, and he thought that Yahweh, the God of Israel, was like those other gods. And he's going to find out differently in this story.
Yes, and we're going to see that. Now, continuing in the story, then a second delegation comes back with more money and with a bigger temptation for Balaam because he is greedy. Okay, so in verse 18, do not believe Balaam when he says, even if the king of Moab would give me all the silver and gold in his palace, I could not go beyond the command of the Lord my God. Okay, first of all, listen, he's a false prophet. Okay, we can't trust what he says. Number two, he's greedy. He's trying to get a better deal with what he's doing here. He does go beyond the command of the Lord God, and he calls Yahweh my God, but he's not dedicated to any God. He's just doing his job. Okay, now in verse 19, when Balaam says, let me see what else the Lord will say, he's looking right there to manipulate God to say something different than the first time when Yahweh actually did appear to him. Okay.
Yeah, and then this is where things get a little confusing. And I think we have to realize that Balaam was used to hearing a lot of voices of so-called gods. So it's confusing for us to read it because verse 20, for example, says God came to Balaam and said, okay, go ahead with these men. And then a few verses later, he's getting upset. So was this the voice of the Lord, of Yahweh? Or was this the voice of some other god, some other Elohim?
I believe it was some other God. And here's a couple of reasons. One was God was very clear the first time, do not go. Okay. Another one, is God changing his mind now? All right. In verse 22, it says, if the Lord Yahweh truly told him to go the second time, why is, again in verse 22, why is the Lord now angry that he goes? That one doesn't really make sense. And also, as you read in the story, 2 times the angel of the Lord was said that he was trying to oppose him, Balaam. Okay? Why would God oppose God's will? See, that doesn't make sense. Okay? The angel of the Lord also said to him, listen, you're on a reckless path. Did Yahweh put him on a reckless path to destroy Israel? No, I don't think so. And by the way, Balaam's name means destroyer. Okay? Notice in verse 35, when the angel of the Lord actually relents and tells him, okay, go, but only speak what I tell you to. Okay. Now, this is opposite in verse 20, where it was a little bit confusing what God that was. Okay. In verse 20, it says, do only what I tell you to do. So it's different here. Okay, let's get into chapter 23 and 24. These 2 chapters contain 7 prophecies of God's people and God's plan spoken by this pagan prophet, okay? In the first 2 prophecies, Balaam has 7 altars built, and he offers 7 bulls and 7 rams, and then he goes to divination, and then after all that, God still puts a word in his mouth to be spoken.
Yeah, and I want to make clear, the Bible very explicitly forbids the use of magic, sorcery, divination, any attempt at all to gain knowledge or power by supernatural or spiritual means. You can look that up in Deuteronomy 18:9 through 13. We don't have a lot of time, but this is super important, so I'm going to put out another short video on that, and I'll link that below when it's done.
That's a lot of videos you got to put out.
Yeah, I know.
Okay, so in the first prophecy, if you look at verse 9, the second part of it, it says, I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves as one of the nations. Right here, this is like what God asked them to do. Remember, God asked them to be holy, to be set apart from the other nations. Balaam sees this right here. And also, let's go on to prophecies 3 and 4. Okay, these are quite different from the first 2. In prophecy 3, he still makes sacrifices, but no longer does he do the divination. But in these 2 prophecies, God's Spirit is going to come on him, And he's going to say, for one who sees clearly, for one who hears God clearly, who has visions of the Almighty, who falls prostrate, and whose eyes are opened.
Yeah. One of the coolest things I see in these prophecies is in Numbers 24, 6, and 7, where there's language of abundance. Okay? Balaam looks at this encampment and he sees a garden. Human beings started out with God in a garden. We read that at the beginning of Genesis, but they were banished from the garden as a result of the fall. But throughout the Torah, God is dropping hints about getting his people back to that place of abundance and fellowship with him. And here's another hint, and I just really love that it's coming out of the mouth of a pagan prophet.
That is amazing. That was actually verses 6 and 7 of 24. I'm not sure if we said that or not. But if you go over to the fourth prophecy in verse 17, this is one of the greatest messianic prophecies we have. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. So it's in a distant future. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel. A ruler will come out of Jacob. And that famous prophecy right there that we use around Christmas time is coming out of a pagan prophecy. It was amazing how God did all that. Then actually, Balaam leaves. It doesn't work. He can't prophesy against Israel, okay? But this next chapter 25, this chapter makes you mad at the devil, who is the arch enemy of God and his people. It says Balaam was a professional diviner who was proficient in his working on the dark side, okay? He was graced to hear the voice of God, but God was merciful to this man who was taking payment to curse God's people who had God's blessing. Because God turned the curse into a blessing, Balaam actually says in 23:23, there's no divination against Jacob. There is no evil omen against Israel. God's protective hedge over his people was impenetrable, okay? Even demonic powers couldn't penetrate it. So Balaam had to go to plan B. And what was plan B? His own prophecies gave him hints of what to do. In 23:9, he says, the people live apart. Remember, I talked about that one. Verse 21, he says, these people, they have no guilt and no perversity is among them. So that's where he found that he had to change that. Okay? So what did he do? As you read in chapter 25, you're going to see the Moabite women enticing the Israelite men to come and do worship with them. First of all, they weren't supposed to bow down to any other god, and they did bow down to that god. And the other nations, they mixed sexual activity into their worship. It was part of their worship. And they got these men enticed in all of that. And so now God had to bring judgment on his people, and that was the whole plan that Balaam wanted to do. So he resorted to plan B. We're not going to go into all the details, but you could read it for yourselves. But a plague breaks out. There's 24,000 people that are killed here. And Revelations 2:14 talks about Balaam, and it says this, and it's warning the churches, the end-time churches. It says, warning, there are some among you who are holding to the teachings of Balaam, who taught Balak to entice the Israelites to sin so that they ate food sacrificed to idols and to commit sexual immorality.
Yeah. And it's interesting because if you're looking just at Numbers 25, you're going to wonder why we're saying that Balaam was involved here. We actually don't get that information until the New Testament. There in Revelation that Frank talked about, and it's also mentioned in 2 Peter, which we're going to get to later in this talk. So it's interesting sometimes when the New Testament gives us some information that even the Old Testament doesn't give us. Okay, we're going to move really quickly through readings 77, 78, and 79, and that's finishing up the book of Numbers. There's just a sad commentary with chapter 26 when they do another census. You may remember that there was a census back in Numbers 2, and if you compare the numbers, you'll see that there was actually a decline in population. As always, God is saying to his people, be fruitful and multiply, and they actually had a decline. And that's a sad commentary. And the other thing I would just want to raise is Numbers 32. We see two of the tribes of Reuben and Gad, make a decision to stay on the east side of the Jordan River and not to go into the land that God promised Abraham. And I'm not sure that I understand what their motivation was, or that I understand if the Bible intends us to see this as a failure on their part, but it does set them up to fulfill the prophecies that Jacob made at the end of the book of Genesis, where he says, Reuben, you will no longer excel, and Gad, you'll be attacked by a band of raiders. And with them being out separate from the rest of the tribes, they set themselves up, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, for an early exit from that community. So there comes a time in the story of the nation as a whole that we just don't hear about these tribes anymore. We don't get a story that something happened, but we don't hear about them anymore.
It's amazing that Jacob prophesied over his sons, and we see that come into pass, and Balaam did some prophecies. We see that come into pass, and words are important.
Okay, this is reading 80. We're going to be looking at 1 Peter. So again, when we look at one of the New Testament letters, we want to ask who it's written by, who it's written to. So this is written by Simon, one of Jesus' disciples, who Jesus renamed Cephas, which is the Aramaic for rock. Now that came into Greek, which is what the New Testament is written in, as Petros, so then that came into English as Peter. It is written to some Gentile believers scattered through part of modern-day Turkey. And Peter's writing from Rome, which he refers to as Babylon. It says he's in Babylon at the end of the book. But that's just in keeping with the theme here that he has of his readers being in exile. And also because in the Old Testament, Babylon is the symbol of all of the forces, both temporal and spiritual, that come against God and his people. So the early church used that as the name for Rome, and perhaps also so if some of their literature got taken,
They won't be talking about Rome.
They're a little sneaky there, yeah. So Jesus had promised Peter that he would be a leader for the earliest Jesus followers, and we see that in Acts 1 through 10. He was a preacher to the Jews, and Paul was the preacher to the Gentiles. But interestingly, it was Peter that God first used to preach to the Gentiles in Acts 10. And that's when the church had the revelation, so even to Gentiles, God has granted repentance that leads to life. So here we see that his ministry had expanded to include Gentiles, and that's who he's writing to here. And this is called a circular letter just because it's circulated around many church communities, not just directed to one church, like a lot of Paul's letters are. This was written around AD 64. This is right around the time that Rome burned. And this is also after most of Paul's letters are written. Why was it written? That's another question we need to ask with these letters is, what was the occasion? What was the purpose of the letter? And this was written to encourage believers to persevere in the middle of persecution for their faith.
Yeah. The themes of 1 Peter, there's three: new family, a new way of living, and a new hope.
Yeah, so let's unpack that a little bit. In chapter 1, Peter talks to these people about how they, and he includes himself in this, we are born again. And so we're members of a new family. We have a new hope. We have a promise of a different inheritance. And if you think of this as a portrait that he's painting, that's the foreground. The background, however, is dark because they are living in trials, suffering, persecution. That is the very present reality for the people he's writing to. But he says in verse 6, this is something that they rejoice in. And we look at that and say, wait a minute, how can trials like this be a good thing? And the answer that Peter gives is that suffering purifies us. It proves our faith, that's verse 7, and it streamlines our lives. And that's something that just really excites me because Frank and I have talked about getting rid of stuff. And we said, there's no way we're ever going to be minimalists. We're going to be reductionists.
Yes.
Okay? But this is talking about streamlining, and that's a word I think about a lot.
Yeah. But I just want to say in verse 7 also, it talks about that their faith, and then he has this little comment in verse 7. It says, of greater worth than gold. And that's why we have the thumbnail in there. Because God says our faith in his sight is greater than even the gold. Gold, he's going to pave heaven with that, but faith is what he really looks for.
Yeah, yeah. So that streamlining, when we have an eternal perspective, when we focus on the salvation and the glory that Christ purchased for us, we live our lives with a streamlined purpose. We have a new way of living. So in keeping with the theme of a family, Peter's saying that they and we have a new family identity. So this is verses 13 and the following verses. When we know that we're heirs of a marvelous inheritance, we adopt a new way of living that's consistent with the inheritance that is going to be ours. Two things that I see that this looks like. Number one, in verse 13, is anticipation. Peter says, set your hope fully on the grace that will come when Jesus is revealed. And then in verse 14, we see separation. Don't be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. So we're talking about holiness again.
Can't get away from it.
Yeah, the former way of life is described in a lot of ways in the next few chapters. Look for them, maybe highlight them, something like that. I'd like to highlight in an ugly color. But hopefully you remember that separation is the key idea of holiness. And it's not just being separate, being away from one thing, like verse 14 says. It's also about being connected to God. And we see in verse 15, be holy, for I am holy. And then being part of a holy community produces love within the family. Okay, this is one of the reasons it's so important to go to church, because you have a community of people who reminds you that the way the world lives is not what's normal. Let's go on to chapter 2. I notice he calls them infants in verse 2. We talked about this in Hebrews. We had similar language, but there it was a scold. This is not a scold or an insult. They've just been born again, so they are baby Christians. The people in Hebrews, they were big baby Christians.
Yeah, not good.
Okay, not good. So as babies, long for pure spiritual milk, so that they can grow up. And of course, that milk is the Word of God.
And their growing up is the faith.
Yeah. But then the author switches the metaphor, and he talks about them being built up like a building. So in the new family, there's a new purpose, and that is to offer spiritual sacrifices. Let's see, this is verse 5. Offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And Jesus is the example. He is the stone the builders rejected. We actually talked about this in the last talk. This comes from Psalm 118. But then it keeps going. It says that Jesus is a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And that's a little bit strange to us. But remember, we've seen in the Gospels over and over again that Jesus' ministry tripped up the religious leaders, the very ones who were studying the Old Testament prophecies, because they had found nuggets that they liked about the Messiah, many of which Jesus will fulfill when he comes back the second time, but they overlooked a lot of the less exciting ones that Jesus fulfilled in his first coming. And a few weeks ago, we talked about how much you might miss if you read your Bible to try to find nuggets that you like. There's a lot in the Bible that challenges us, and this very book talks a lot about suffering. That's not something that we really like to think about. And honestly, a lot of Western Christians kind of live in a bubble as far as knowing what suffering for their faith is like. We're going to talk about that a little bit more later. So it's good to understand the whole context of what we're reading in the Bible and not just grab little pieces, little verses that look shiny and bright to us. But there is a bright, shiny verse here, and I want to look at 1 Peter 2:9. This is a great verse to memorize. It says, you are. So this is talking about your identity as a believer. You are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession. But don't leave out the next half of the verse, because it talks about why you're chosen, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Okay, I love that. But then verse 11 uses some words to describe them that maybe are not quite so exciting. That I've got sojourners, exiles here. There's another version I read that uses the word strangers, aliens. So what's happening is we're being reminded again to be holy, to be separate, to be other, not to be like the people around us. And there are some specific ways. He's going to give some examples to try to help them to know what that looks like. So he does 3 specific scenarios.
Okay, one is all of you honor the Lord by being subject for his sake to ungodly government.
Yeah, that's
okay?
starting in chapter 2, verse 13.
Verse 18 is servants honor the Lord. How? By being subject to ungodly masters. And number 3 is wives honor the Lord by being subject to ungodly husbands.
And that's in chapter 3. So again, kind of unpacking that a little bit more. All of you follow the law, even when it's passed by an ungodly government. Servants, don't neglect your job because you have an ungodly master. Do your job well. Wives, even with an ungodly husband, don't preach to them. It says, your respectful and pure conduct, this is chapter 3, verse 2, will win them over quicker than your words will. So if we go on to verse 8 of chapter 3, it starts the general scenario. And again, what we've said before, this is a pagan setting and they're undergoing persecution. And chapter 4, again, has a lot of the same ideas and gives Jesus as the example of perseverance. I think verse 19 is really a key verse. It says this, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. There's a lesson of faith here. When we choose to submit because God tells us to, it takes a lot of faith to believe that God is going to work that situation out for good. Now, reading 81 brings us to the last chapter of 1 Peter, and I just want to note there's another specific submission. Verse 5, it says, likewise, you who are younger, these are young believers in the church, be subject to the elders of the church. Learn from your leaders, from those who are older and wiser in the faith than you are.
And also in verse 6, there's a great principle here. Humble yourselves before the Lord, before God's mighty hand, that he may lift you in due season. I always like to think of it like this. Promotion in God's kingdom is through humility and not through effort, because God does the promoting. And in verse 9, he talks about resisting and standing firm in the faith and resisting the enemy. And we need to be alert and sober-minded because the enemy goes around like a roaring lion. Because Israel, we just talked about, they didn't even know the enemy was planning behind the mountains and overlooking them.
Oh, they were prowling around, very literally.
They literally were going from mountaintop to mountaintop looking to try to do a curse on them. It didn't work, but they were prowling. And we need to be alert and sober-minded. So, because Satan is doing these things, and our faith needs to be strong.
Okay, now we're going to move to 2 Peter. Basically, a lot of the same introductory information in this book. We know now that Peter was martyred in AD 68 in Nero's persecution. I think Paul was also. This letter may have been written from prison, actually. So the question is, why did Peter write this letter? Because he knew he was going to die soon, and he had a few last things he wanted to make sure he said.
One of the things he says that's really powerful, and we'll just go right to it. In verse 10 of chapter 1, he says, therefore, my brothers, make every effort to confirm your calling and election, for if you do these things, you will never stumble. Which is an amazing prophecy. But what is these things? Okay, if you go back over to verse 5, he says, make every effort to add to your faith. So it starts with faith. Okay, add to faith goodness, and to goodness knowledge. I always like how goodness is before knowledge, because if you're not good, if you have faith and you have knowledge, but you're not good, you're just a terrible person, that's a terrible Christian. So you have to have goodness in there, but the knowledge is key. And if you'll look and count how many times. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4 or 5 times in these 10 verses. We're not going to go through them. We don't have the time. But the knowledge of God is so important in verses 2 and in verses 3 there. So add to your faith goodness, and goodness knowledge, self-control, perseverance. You could read the list. But if you'll do that list and do these qualities in increasing measures, they'll keep you from being ineffective and unproductive of your knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Okay. So this is a really short book, just 3 chapters. I think you'll really enjoy it if you take some notes. So we're not going to talk through it at length. I just want to give you a quick outline. So I made a slide, and I want you to fill in the blanks. So this is my outline of 2 Peter. A reminder, a warning, and a reminder. So take a look. What are the reminders? And what is the warning? Take some notes on what's being talked about there, what the major themes are. See what it was that Peter thought was so important that he had to write one more letter before he died.
And for Numbers, there's a slide for Numbers?
We have a slide for Numbers.
Okay, to remember the book of Numbers, it's Israel's complaining and failures and God's covenant faithfulness. CFs, okay?
Yep.
CFs.
Okay.
If you remember them, you could do good and remember the book of Numbers.
Yeah. There's so much in 1 Peter about persecution and suffering for the name of Christ. And like I said earlier, so much of the Western church for a really long time, probably a couple of centuries even, we've been able to be very ignorant of the persecution that so much of the church is experiencing. We tend to think of persecution as something that happened to the early church. But actually, there is more persecution of Christians right now than at any other time in church history. So that's something to make yourself aware of. You could even find pretty recent news stories that talk about persecution of Christians in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in Syria, and then much more long-term than that, there are major problems in North Korea. It is incredibly difficult to be a Christian there. And it's interesting because what this tells us, what 1 Peter tells us about resisting the devil, is the surprising way that they are to do that is to submit to and to love their enemies. And when people go and talk to members of the persecuted church, we would think the way we should pray for them is that the persecution would end. But so often their prayer request is, please pray that we will be faithful. Pray that we will love our enemies. Pray that we will be bold to continue to spread the gospel. So I just want to emphasize that there are a couple of organizations that you can get a lot of information so you can pray for the persecuted church. And I'll link some of those too.
Good. Okay.
Okay, I guess that's all we have for today.
Yes. And thank you for being with us, and we'll see you next
I'm
talk.
going to wave.
Bye-bye.
Bye.